Hi, you have we have today Dr. Deanna Barch with us. So this is Science Hangout from Science Mission. Dr. Barch is a chair Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at the Washington University. She is interested in understanding interplay among cognition, emotion, and brain function to better understand the deficits in behavior cognition found in illnesses such as schizophrenia and depression. Dr. Barch has received several fellowships, grants, and published more than 260 research articles in peer-reviewed journals. Dr. Barch has won several awards. I'll name only a few because of the lack of time. So in 2016, he received Arthur Hawley Compton Faculty Achievement Award. Again in 2016 from the Association of Women in Neuroscience Mentor Award. 2013, she was the member of American College of Neuropsychopharmacology. 2012, president of Society for Research in Psychopathology. She got Gregory Couch Professor of Psychiatry. So without going further, let's talk to Dr. Barch. So Dr. Barch, welcome you to Science Hangout.
Thank you for having me.
And can you please tell me about yourself, your education and background, etc.?
Yeah, so I am formally trained as a clinical psychologist. So I have a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. And I got that after getting my bachelor's degree in psychology from Northwestern University. And after I finished my PhD, I went on to do an internship and a postdoctoral fellowship at Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh, where I learned about using functional neuroimaging and computational modeling to try to understand the kind of brain behavior relationships that contribute to impairments in cognition and motivation in people with mental illnesses like schizophrenia and depression. And I started as a faculty here at Washington University back in 1998, and I've been here ever since.
And why did you choose to become a psychologist?
I was always interested in being a psychologist, even from when I was in high school. I didn't know a lot about research when I was in high school, but I was always interested in sort of what made people tick and, trying to, work with folks who were having challenges in life. And when I went to college, then I kind of got the research bug and got interested in really, research that would help us understand the causes of mental illness, potentially as a means of identifying better pathways for treatment.
And in your long career, do you have any supporters like mentors or coaches
Oh
who
yeah,
help you in reaching where you are right now?
yeah, no, many people, it takes a village, and so, for example, I would never have really gotten involved in research if not for the professor who taught my abnormal psychology class when I was in undergraduate, and she, Lauren Alloy, who's a professor now at Temple University, kind of, plucked a number of us out of class who did relatively well and said, hey, would you be interested in research? And, was really formative and kind of setting me on that path. And then, my mentor in graduate school, Howard Barenbaum at the University of Illinois, was a great supporter, and Jonathan Cohen, who was my mentor as a postdoc, and many people here at Washington University who have been very supportive throughout my career. So yes, definitely many mentors and very helpful people.
And other than research, do you have other hobbies or anything like what you do after your work?
So I'm a pretty boring person because I'm a workaholic, but I do have a
Okay.
family and I have 2 kids, and so the majority of my free time is spent doing stuff with my kids and my family. I honestly, I don't really have a lot of hobbies outside of my family and my work.
Okay, that's good. Yeah. And let's talk about your research and your lab and lab people. Can you briefly explain how your lab works? Talk about some lab people and all.
Yeah, so I have a kind of an unusual lab in the sense that I really don't have my own lab. Instead, I actually have sort of several shared labs. So I have appointments at Washington University, both in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences and in Psychiatry and Radiology. And I physically have a lab sort of in both departments. And so I share one lab actually with my husband, who's also a cognitive neuroscientist. His name is Todd Breger. And we came to Washington University together, and we share a lab and collaborate quite extensively on a number of research projects. And so we physically share lab space, and our graduate students and postdocs and staff, are all housed together. But then I also collaborate with other people like Joan Luby and David Van Essen, who are other researchers, and we share lab space physically as well. So my students and postdocs tend to be, interacting with students and postdocs from, other faculty as well. I tend to have a fairly big lab, so, I love mentoring graduate students and postdocs. So right now I have 5 graduate students and or 2 or 3 postdocs, depending on how you count them. And, a lot of research assistants and undergraduate research assistants and other more junior faculty that I work with as well. So it's a pretty large and collaborative lab environment.
And can you talk about your research and basically go with the presentation eventually?
Right. So I actually have a number of different lines of research. So I have a chunk of my research is really focused on understanding the neural and psychological mechanisms that contribute to cognitive and motivational impairments among individuals who are experiencing psychosis and schizophrenia in particular. And that's what I'm going to talk more about today. And so that line of research uses functional neuroimaging and cognitive and experimental tasks to try to understand why people with schizophrenia or kind of other forms of psychosis are having these difficulties, so that we can maybe think about better treatment pathways. But I also have a line of research looking at the effects of early onset depression and early adversity, and how that influences the development of brain function and structure, and how that may be contributing to impairments and behaviors that contribute to depression and other kinds of early childhood, psychopathology. And then I have a line of research that's just more kind of understanding basic brain behavior relationships. So I've been really involved in a project called the Human Connectome Project, which is designed to try to understand normative patterns of brain connectivity, both structural and functional. And we're just starting some new parts of that project where we're going to be looking at brain connectivity across the lifespan, both early in development and later in life, but again, in relatively more healthy people, to understand kind of basic relationships, so that we can then better understand when things are kind of going awry from that normal trajectory of brain development. Yeah.
And with that note, could you please start your presentation?
Sure. Hold on. Okay, so what I'm going to share today is some of the work that we've been doing trying to understand the psychological and neural mechanisms that contribute to problems with motivation among people with psychosis. And so what I mean by motivational impairments in psychosis are the fact that some of the symptoms of schizophrenia are things like anhedonia, or a sort of a supposed lack of enjoyment from life's experiences, difficulties feeling or predicting pleasure, or reduced initiative to engage in goal-directed activities, so difficulties, working or attending school, and then also what's been referred to as asociality, or kind of a reduced interest or initiative to interact with other people. And these kind of aspects of schizophrenia are part of the diagnostic criteria by which we decide whether someone has this illness. They're not present in every individual, but they are present in many people. They can be present prior to the onset of the illness. So sometimes we see these things starting to emerge in adolescents as they are starting to develop psychosis. In some cases, it can predict the development of psychosis. And it seems to be present even between kind of active episodes of psychosis. And importantly, it's really strongly associated with functional impairment, meaning the more people with schizophrenia experience these kinds of motivational impairments, the more difficulties they seem to be having in everyday life, in being able to live independently, and being able to have a job or work, or to have meaningful interpersonal relationships. So all of this kind of comes together to suggest that these are, a really critical aspect of the illness to understand. And so we've spent a lot of time trying to understand, well, what might be causing these motivational impairments? And we have found it useful to kind of have a model of what we think normally lets people engage in motivated and goal-directed behavior. And I don't have time today to talk about all of this model, but we like to think of it as kind of, the nuts and bolts of motivation, going from what people have referred to as hedonics, or the fact that you kind of need to like and enjoy things in the first place in order to be motivated to get them again in the future. And if we look at the neurobiology literature, that literature suggests that one's ability to like things is supported by certain neurotransmitter systems in the brain, such as the opioid and GABA systems in the brain and the orbital frontal cortex. Then there's also kind of systems involved in predicting what is going to lead to reward, or learning about what predicts reward. That's sometimes referred to as reinforcement learning. And that is thought to be supported by the dopamine system in the basal ganglia. Then there's also parts of the system that are involved in helping you decide kind of the cost-benefit analysis. Any kind of good outcome requires some effort typically, and we have to decide how much do we really value that outcome, and how much effort do we want to put into getting that. And so we refer to that as cost-benefit analysis. And there are different parts of the brain that seem to be involved in different aspects of that. So the orbital frontal cortex is important for kind of updating and maintaining what we would refer to as value. And value takes into account how much you like something, but it also takes into account like the current state of the system. So just to give you a concrete example, say you really like chocolate chip cookies. Well, how much you value chocolate chip cookies, or getting a chocolate chip cookie right now, is going to depend on how recently you've had a chocolate chip cookie, how hungry you are. So I might value a chocolate chip cookie a lot more if I'm starving than if I've just already eaten 10 other chocolate chip cookies. Another aspect of this is how much effort you'd have to put out in order to get that chocolate chip cookie. So if there's a plate of chocolate chip cookies sitting right in front of me and I can just reach out and grab one, that doesn't take a lot of cost. But if I actually have to get up and go buy one, or I have to actually go and bake one, there's a lot more cost associated with getting that chocolate chip cookie. And so I may be less willing to engage in those behaviors because the cost-benefit analysis is not so good. And then lastly, you have to have some sort of action plan to obtain that valued outcome. So staying along with my chocolate chip cookie example, if I decide I really want a chocolate chip cookie and it's worth the effort to bake it, I've got to come up with a plan for collecting the ingredients and, actually carrying out the steps that would get me to that nice, warm, yummy chocolate chip cookie in the end. So an impairment anywhere along the line of these kind of different parts of the system that link liking something to actually engaging in behaviors, goal-directed behaviors, could lead to difficulties in engaging in those goal-directed behaviors. So we and others have spent a lot of time looking at what parts of the system seem to be intact and what parts of the system seem to be not so intact among people with schizophrenia. So if we start at the beginning in terms of hedonics or liking, what we see is that, kind of somewhat surprisingly, these things tend to be relatively intact among people with schizophrenia. So in the moment, when you are presenting someone with schizophrenia with something, some sort of reward or positive outcome or positive experience, They will self-report, liking that as much, for the most part, as someone without schizophrenia. And if you measure different aspects of neural responses to receiving positive outcomes, those are really relatively intact among individuals with schizophrenia. And so this suggests that the kind of challenges leading to motivational and goal-directed action impairments in schizophrenia are not because they don't enjoy the outcomes that they would get should they engage in those behaviors. If we go then to reward prediction or reinforcement learning, there it may be important, and I won't have time to talk about all of these, to make some distinctions. So one distinction is between what people have referred to as implicit versus explicit reinforcement learning. And by implicit, I really mean something that happens relatively automatically and a little bit, say, outside your conscious awareness. So you may not be aware of the fact that you're learning about things that lead to reward. Whereas explicit reinforcement learning, you are sort of actively trying to figure out what actions in the environment or what objects in the environment or what experiences in the environment are going to lead to reward. And you're sort of consciously thinking about, oh, if I do this, I think it's going to lead to a positive outcome. There's also probably an important distinction, and we may not have time to talk about it today, between learning about what sorts of things lead to positive outcomes versus learning to avoid things that lead to negative outcomes. And there are actually some interesting differences there in the neural systems that support learning from positive outcomes versus learning from negative outcomes. And in theory, at least, those you could have an impairment in one and not the other. When we look in folks with schizophrenia, we actually see some interesting dissociations here. So we and others have looked at this more implicit aspect of reinforcement learning, this aspect that happens without a lot of conscious awareness on the part of the individual, using a task developed by a guy at Harvard named Diego Pizzagalli. And this is a very simple task. I show it on the screen here. And what happens is that people are presented with a little face with eyes, and they're told their job is simply to decide whether the mouth that's shown is a short mouth or a long mouth. And they get presented with a series of these trials, and every trial it's either a short mouth or a long mouth. And their job is just to say, is it short or is it long? And sort of unbeknownst to them, what happens is that on a certain number of trials, they get feedback about whether they're correct or not, and the feedback indicates that they have earned some money. And they always get correct feedback. But what happens is that they get that feedback more frequently for one type of mouth versus another type of mouth. So more frequently for a short mouth than a long mouth. And over time, that leads people to develop a bias to respond short mouth or long mouth because that is the more frequently rewarded one. And that bias, the development of that bias, is evidence that they are successfully learning from positive reinforcement. And interestingly, when people do this task, they are really unaware that there is this different amount of reward that they get for one mouth versus the other. But yet their behavior shows evidence that they're learning from this positive reinforcement. So when you, and there's evidence that this kind of learning is dependent on a part of the brain called the striatum. And sometimes people refer to it as slow striatal learning. So when we look in schizophrenia, we actually see evidence that this kind of learning is really pretty intact. So this graph over here on the left is higher scores are greater bias, which is evidence that people are actually learning. And we do multiple blocks of this task, so block 1, block 2, block 3, and the open bars are healthy controls and the dark bars are folks with schizophrenia. And what you see is that the data looks pretty similar whether you're a healthy control or you're an individual with schizophrenia. And so this is data from a colleague. This is data from our own lab here. Oops, and I seem to be missing my bars here, but the blue are healthy controls, and the green and the red are people with schizophrenia. These are the healthy controls, these are the folks with schizophrenia, and these are the different blocks. And you can see, if anything, the people with schizophrenia are actually showing a greater bias, suggesting that they are learning implicitly just fine about positive reinforcement. We've also done this in people who have kind of a related form of psychosis called schizoaffective disorder. So here's controls, folks, in this case with bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and schizoaffective disorder. And again, they all show clear evidence of developing this bias, suggesting that they're able to learn from implicit positive reinforcement. There we go. Maybe even a little bit increased in folks with bipolar disorder. But now, what if we make it more explicit? And this individual in the corner here is my grad student, Adam Culbreth, who worked on this project. So in this explicit reinforcement learning paradigm, people have to learn consciously about how to make choices and how to execute actions that will lead to reward. And I won't go into detail here because this is a little bit complicated, but they just get presented with sort of arbitrary pictures on the screen, one of which is more likely to lead to a small monetary reward than the other. And they have to learn over time, and we're a little bit tricky. And after they learn, we switch the reinforcement contingencies. And so now the thing that used to be rewarded is not so rewarded, and the thing that didn't used to be rewarded is rewarded. And we try to see if people can learn that new experience. And people try consciously to figure out which of these two pictures is more likely to be associated with reward. Well, if we look at behavior in schizophrenia on this task, it is now quite impaired. So this is the number of correct trials on this task in healthy controls and folks with schizophrenia. And you can see that it's lower among individuals with schizophrenia. If we look at the number of times they're able to figure out that we've reversed those reinforcement contingencies, it's lower among people with schizophrenia. And if we look at if they win, if they get a reward, how likely they are to do that same action again, which is an indicator that you've kind of figured out that you got rewarded for that, we see that the people with schizophrenia are less likely to do that. So now when people can actually sort of consciously try to learn about things that are reinforcing, we see evidence that the folks with schizophrenia have difficulties learning as well as healthy controls, whereas they didn't have any difficulty learning from that more implicit, subconscious, sometimes people call reinforcement learning. Interestingly, then, when we look at what kinds of brain changes or brain differences are associated with that difficulty learning, I mentioned before that kind of implicit reinforcement learning has been associated with a part of the brain referred to as the striatum. There's other parts of the brain that are thought to be more important for what we might refer to as cognitive control or explicit learning or responding to errors. And those parts of the brain seem to be less active among individuals when they try to do this kind of explicit reinforcement learning. So this is a graph of activity in the brain that is reduced among individuals with schizophrenia. To help you understand this graph, this is going from the top of the brain down to the bottom of the brain. This is the front of the brain, the back of the brain. Your eyeballs would be somewhere down here. And all these regions in red are regions where individuals with schizophrenia show less brain activity in response to feedback information than healthy controls. And that includes parts of the brain like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate, the posterior parietal cortex, that are all thought to be important for regulating your behavior, controlling your behavior, or what people might refer to as cognitive control. Oh, I just got ahead of myself there, so all that again. All of these things show reduced activity in patients with schizophrenia, and more importantly, they predict behavior. So among the individuals with schizophrenia, those who perform better are those who show the most activity in these brain regions, suggesting that part of what's going on with these motivational impairments is the ability to sort of use cognitive control systems to try to learn about what sorts of things might predict reward and positive outcomes in the world. Kind of surprisingly, we see really pretty intact activity in the striatum where this kind of slow reinforcement learning is thought to happen. One way to look at that is something called prediction error, and prediction error happens when you expect that you should be getting a reward and you don't. And we know from animal and human research that you get increased signaling in the striatum when this happens. And we see, and so this is another picture of the brain. This is a slightly different view. This view is like if I kind of sliced off the front of your face and was looking inside your brain. And you've got left and right. And these nice yellow blobs here are the striatum. And we see really very similar responses in the striatum among both the individuals with schizophrenia and the healthy controls. So again, suggesting that some of these challenges are coming from problems engaging brain regions in the prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex that are involved in regulating behavior, and not so much in these striatal regions that are kind of thought to be involved in more of this slow reinforcement learning. So good evidence that reward prediction and reinforcement learning are impaired in schizophrenia, but that it may be more related to explicit reinforcement learning and reward prediction and not so much implicit. And in this, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over this because I'm going to kind of skip to effort, because I think this is something that is very intuitive when we think about why people might have difficulties with motivation and goal-directed action. So before I gave my example about the chocolate chip cookie and pointed out, well, you might really love a chocolate chip cookie, but not really want to go to the effort of going to the store or baking it yourself. And so, you know, you can think of that playing out in other parts of people's lives too. You know, you might really want to get a better job, but that's going to require some sort of effort. Or you might really want to go hang out with friends, but you're not really sure you want to go to the effort of calling everybody up and organizing it and making all the plans. So, you know, understanding what drives individual differences and how much effort people think will be associated with doing things and how much they're willing to put out may be a really important aspect of understanding motivational impairments in people who have different aspects of mental illness. And from the animal literature, we know that a particular neurotransmitter system called the dopamine system seems to be really important for influencing how much effort animals and humans are willing to put out. So if you kind of reduce the amount of dopamine available, animals and humans seem to be less willing to exert effort to gain positive outcomes, even though they like them just as much. And if you look at parts of the brain like the anterior cingulate, if you do something to the anterior cingulate or make it harder for it to do its job, people are also less willing to exert effort. So again, we and others have looked at this in folks with schizophrenia using kind of a clever task developed by Michael Treadway, who's now at Emory University. So in this task, people are told, look, you can either do an easy task or a hard task. The easy task is pushing a button with your non-dominant pinky finger 21 times in 7 seconds, which is not super hard to do, although it's a little bit of a pain. Or you can do a hard task, which is pushing a button 100 times in 21 seconds with your non-dominant pinky finger. And that's more of a pain. If you've ever tried to do that, it's kind of hard. It hurts a little bit. And so on every trial, they can say, okay, you can choose. You can either do the easy task in order to have a chance at winning $1, or you can do a harder task to earn some amount of money that's greater. And we vary how much greater, anywhere from like $1.60 to $4. And the other trick here is that every trial has a probability. So if you do the hard task successfully, you have a certain probability of winning the amount of money. So it could either be 88% probability, which is pretty good. It could be 50% probability, which is so-so. And in some versions of the task, they even do 12% probability, which nobody really likes to do the hard task for that. So when we look at folks with schizophrenia, we see quite clearly that they do show some difficulties in being willing to choose the hard task. So let me unpack this graph for everybody. So what I have plotted here are the number of times that they're willing to choose the hard task. So higher is more likely to choose the hard task. And then plot along here is how much money they would get if they chose the hard task. So over here, you get more money. Over here, you get less money. So if you look over here, you can see that everybody, healthy controls and folks with schizophrenia, aren't particularly excited about choosing the hard task when it's not a whole lot of extra money. But everybody is a bit more excited about choosing the hard task when it's worth more money. That's pretty intuitive. What you see in terms of differences between folks with schizophrenia and healthy controls, though, is that folks with schizophrenia don't show as big of an increase in the willingness to choose the hard task as money goes up. It's not that they don't show any increase, but it's not as big of an increase as we see in folks who don't have schizophrenia. Similarly, if you look at probability, you see that when there's only a 50-50 chance that you're going to get the money, people are a little bit willing to choose the hard task, but in healthy controls, that goes up when it's more likely that you're actually going to win the money. And it doesn't go up as much among people with schizophrenia. So it's not that they never choose the hard task, but the increase in choosing the hard task isn't as great when the amount of money they can win goes up or when the probability of winning goes up. Importantly, how much they're willing to increase that is predictive of their function in the real world. So what I have plotted here are ratings by an objective informant of how well that person is functioning in their community and at work. So higher scores here indicate better function. Higher scores here mean more willingness to increase your hard choices when there's a greater probability of winning. And what you can see here is that people who are functioning better in the community are more likely to choose the hard task. Or to put it another way around, the more likely it is that you are willing to put out extra effort to be more likely to gain an outcome, the better you're functioning in everyday life. And again, that suggests an important link between kind of cost-benefit analysis and willingness to exert effort and how well people do in everyday life. We're just about out of time. I'll just summarize the saying. We've also looked at this kind of effort allocation for cognitive effort. That task we would consider a physical effort task, and we see a related finding in schizophrenia on this cognitive effort task. So just to briefly summarize, if we think about this in terms of pathways to motivational impairments in schizophrenia, what the literature and the data suggests so far is that hedonics, or one's liking of positive outcomes, is pretty intact in folks with schizophrenia. But that we see clear evidence for impairments in reward prediction and explicit reinforcement learning, but that implicit reinforcement learning seems to be pretty intact. I didn't have time to talk about problems with generating action plans and maintaining action plans, but there's lots of evidence for impairments in that aspect in schizophrenia. And then we also see evidence of impaired effort allocation, and it may be related to difficulties kind of figuring out what things are going to lead to positive outcomes, or keeping track of what sorts of things lead to positive outcomes, and therefore being less willing or less able to allocate more effort to gain those positive outcomes. And that in turn may be contributing to reduced motivated behaviors in everyday life among people with schizophrenia. And what that means is, if we're thinking about intervention, we don't want to intervene back here because liking of positive outcomes seems to be pretty intact, but we might want to intervene somewhere over here, either helping people to kind of figure out what it is that's going to lead to positive outcomes, helping them keep that in mind, and helping them have the kind of resources to allocate more effort in order to gain those positive outcomes. So I'll stop there, and unshare my screen so that we can wrap up. Oh, I think you might still be on mute.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking time and giving a nice presentation. So I won't go in detail on the questions, and also we can discuss further because of the lack of time. But really, I appreciate you, despite of
Sure.
all the problems we had, technical problems, we were able to make it, and I won't take any more of your time again. Thank you so much, and we'll
Sure.
keep in touch.
Okay, great. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.